This is section 77 of Mark Twain, a Biography. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mark Twain, a Biography, Volume 1, Part 2, 1866 to 1875. Chapter 77. The Galaxy. Mark Twain's work on the Express represented only a portion of his literary activities during his Buffalo residence. The Galaxy, an ambitious New York magazine of that day, published by Sheldon and Company at 498 and 500 Broadway, proposed to him that he conduct for them a humorous department. They would pay $2,400 a year for the work, and allow him a free hand. There was some discussion as to book rights, but the arrangement was concluded, and his first installment, under the general title of Memoranda, appeared in the May number, 1870. In his introductory he outlined what the reader might expect, such as exhaustive statistical tables, patent office reports, and complete instructions about farming, even from the grafting of the seed to the harrowing of the matured crops. He declared that he would throw a pathos into the subject of agriculture that would surprise and delight the world. He added that the Memoranda was not necessarily a humorous department. "I would not conduct an exclusively and professedly humorous department for any one. I would always prefer to have the privilege of printing a serious and sensible remark, in case one occurred to me, without the reader's feeling obliged to consider himself outraged. Puns cannot be allowed a place in this department. No circumstance, however dismal, will ever be considered a sufficient excuse for the admission of that last and saddest evidence of intellectual poverty, the pun." The Galaxy was really a fine magazine, with the best contributors obtainable, among them Justin McCarthy, S. M. B. Piatt, Richard Grant White, and many others well known in that day, with names that still flicker here and there in its literary twilight. The new department appealed to Clemens, and very soon he was writing most of his sketches for it. They were better literature, as a rule, than those published in his own paper. The first number of the Memoranda was fairly representative of those that followed it. "The Facts in the Case of the Great Beef Contract," a manuscript which he had undertaken 3 years before and mislaid, was its initial contribution. Besides the Beef Contract, there was a tribute to George Wakeman, a well-known journalist of those days, a stricture on the Rev. T. DeWitt Talmage, who had delivered from the pulpit an argument against workingmen occupying pews in fashionable churches, a presentment of the Chinese situation in San Francisco, depicting the cruel treatment of the celestial immigrant, a burlesque of the Sunday school "good little boy" story, the story of the good little boy who did not prosper, and the Beef Contract are included in Sketches New and Old; also the Chinese sketch under the title "Disgraceful Persecution of a Boy," and several shorter skits and anecdotes, 10 pages in all, a rather generous contract. Mark Twain's comment on Talmage was prompted by an article in which Talmage had assumed the premise that if workingmen attended the churches it would drive the better class of worshipers away. Among other things he said: "I have a good Christian friend who, if he sat in the front pew in church, and a workingman should enter the door at the other end, would smell him instantly. My friend is not to blame for the sensitiveness of his nose any more than you would flog a pointer for being keener on the scent than a stupid watchdog. The fact is, if you had all the churches free, by reason of the mixing of the common people with the uncommon, you would keep one half of Christendom sick at their stomach. If you are going to kill the church thus with bad smells, I will have nothing to do with this work of evangelization." Commenting on this, Mark Twain said, "Well, he said a good deal more than we have room for here, but a portion of his closing paragraphs is worth preserving. He compares the Reverend Mr. Talmage with the early disciples of Christ, Paul and Peter and the others, or rather he contrasts him with them. They healed the very beggars and held intercourse with people of villainous odor every day. If the subject of these remarks had been chosen among the original 12 apostles, he would not have associated with the rest, because he could not have stood the fishy smell of some of his comrades who came from around the Sea of Galilee. He would have resigned his commission with some such remark as he makes in the extract quoted above: 'Master, if thou art going to kill the church thus with bad smells, I will have nothing to do with this work of evangelization.' He is a disciple, and makes that remark to the Master. The only difference is that he makes it in the 19th instead of the 1st century." Talmage was immensely popular at this time, and Mark Twain's open attack on him must have shocked a good many Galaxy readers, as perhaps his article on the Chinese cruelties offended the citizens of San Francisco. It did not matter. He was not likely to worry over the friends he would lose because of any stand taken for human justice. Lamed said of him, "He was very far from being one who tried any way to make himself popular." Certainly he never made any such attempt at the expense of his convictions. The first Galaxy installment was a sort of platform of principles for the campaign that was to follow. Not that each month's contribution contained personal criticism, or a defense of the Chinese, of whom he was always the champion as long as he lived, but a good many of them did. In the October number he began a series of letters under the general title of "Goldsmith's Friend Abroad Again," supposed to have been written by a Chinese immigrant in San Francisco, detailing his experience there. In a note the author says, "No experience is set down in the following letters which had to be invented. Fancy is not needed to give variety to the history of the Chinaman's sojourn in America. Plain fact is amply sufficient." The letters show how the supposed Chinese writer of them had set out for America, believing it to be a land whose government was based on the principle that all men are created equal, and treated accordingly; how, upon arriving in San Francisco, he was kicked and bruised and beaten, and set upon by dogs, flung into jail, tried and condemned without witnesses, his own race not being allowed to testify against Americans Irish Americans in the San Francisco court. They are scathing, powerful letters, and one cannot read them, even in this day of improved conditions, without feeling the hot waves of resentment and indignation which Mark Twain must have felt when he penned them. Reverend Mr. Talmage was not the only divine to receive attention in the memoranda. The Reverend Mr. Sabine, of New York, who had declined to hold a church burial service for the old actor George Holland, came in for the most caustic as well as the most artistic stricture of the entire series. It deserves preservation today, not only for its literary value, but because no finer defense of the drama, no more searching sermon on self-righteousness, has ever been put into concrete form. The indignity put upon the remains of George Holland by the Reverend Mr. Sabine. Galaxy for February, 1871. The reader will find it complete under Appendix J at the end of last volume. The "Little Church Around the Corner" on 29th Street received that happy title from this incident. "There is a little church around the corner that will perhaps permit the service," Mr. Sabine had said to Holland's friends. The little church did permit the service, and there was conferred upon it the new name, which it still bears. It has sheltered a long line of actor folk and their friends since then, earning thereby reverence, gratitude, and immortal memory. Church of the Transfiguration. Memorial services were held there for Joseph Jefferson, and a memorial window by John Lafarge has been placed there in memory of Edwin Booth. Of the Galaxy contributions a number are preserved in sketches, new and old. How I Edited an Agricultural Paper is one of the best of these, an excellent example of Mark Twain's more extravagant style of humor. It is perennially delightful. In France it has been dramatized and is still played. A successful Galaxy feature, also preserved in the sketches, was the burlesque map of Paris, reprinted from the Express. The Franco-Prussian War was in progress, and this travesty was particularly timely. It creates only a smile of amusement today, but it was all fresh and delightful then. Schuyler Colfax, by this time Vice President, wrote to him: "I have had the heartiest possible laugh over it, and so have all my family. You are a wicked conscienceless wag, who ought to be punished severely." The official commendations which accompany the map are its chief charm. They are from Grant, Bismarck, Brigham Young, and others, the best one coming from one J. Smith, who says: "My wife was for years afflicted with freckles, and though everything was done for her relief that could be done, all was in vain. But, sir, since her first glance at your map, they have entirely left her. She has nothing but convulsions now." It is said that the map of Paris found its way to Berlin, where the American students in the beer halls used to pretend to quarrel over it until they attracted the attention of the German soldiers that might be present. Then they would wander away and leave it on the table and watch results. The soldiers would pounce upon it and lose their tempers over it, then finally abuse it and revile its author, to the satisfaction of everybody. The larger number of memoranda sketches have properly found oblivion today. They were all, or nearly all, collected by a Canadian pirate, C. A. Backus, in a volume bearing the title of Memoranda; also by a harpy named John Camden Hotten, of London, of whom we shall hear again. Hotten had already pirated The Innocents, and had it on the market before Routledge could bring out the authorized edition. Routledge later published the memoranda under the title of Sketches, including the contents of the Jumping Frog book. Editor's note: Memoranda was a book long ago suppressed. Only about 20 of the Galaxy contributions found place in Sketches, New and Old, 5 years later, and some of these might have been spared as literature. To Raise Poultry, John Chinaman in New York, and History Repeats Itself are valuable only as examples of his work at that period. The reader may consult them for himself. End of Chapter 77, The Galaxy, read by John Greenman. This is section 78 of Mark Twain, a Biography. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mark Twain, a Biography, Volume 1, Part 2, 1866 to 1875. Chapter 78, The Primrose Path. But we are losing sight of more important things. From the very beginning Mark Twain's home meant always more to him than his work. The life at 472 Delaware Avenue had begun with as fair a promise as any matrimonial journey ever undertaken. There seemed nothing lacking: a beautiful home, sufficient income, bright prospects. These things, with health and love, constitute married happiness. Mrs. Clemens wrote to her sister, Mrs. Crane, at the end of February: "Sue, we are two as happy people as you ever saw. Our days seem to be made up of only bright sunlight, with no shadow in them." In the same letter the husband added, "Livy pines and pines every day for you, and I pine and pine every day for you, and when we both of us are pining at once you would think it was a whole pine forest let loose." To Redpath, who was urging lecture engagements for the coming season, he wrote: Dear Red, I am not going to lecture any more for ever. I have got things ciphered down to a fraction now. I know just about what it will cost to live, and I can make the money without lecturing. Therefore, old man, count me out. And still later in May, I guess I am out of the field permanently. Have got a lovely wife, a lovely house, bewitchingly furnished, a lovely carriage, and a coachman whose style and dignity are simply awe-inspiring, nothing less, and I am making more money than necessary, by considerable, and therefore why crucify myself nightly on the platform? The subscriber will have to be excused for the present season at least. So they were very happy during those early months, acquiring pleasantly the education which any matrimonial experience is sure to furnish, accustoming themselves to the uses of housekeeping, to life in partnership, with all the discoveries and mental and spiritual adaptations that belong to the close association of marriage. They were far, very far apart on many subjects. He was unpolished, untrained, impulsive, sometimes violent. Twichell remembers that in the earlier days of their acquaintance he wore a slouch hat pulled down in front, and smoked a cigar that sometimes tilted up and touched the brim of it. The atmosphere and customs of frontier life, the Westernisms of that day, still clung to him. Mrs. Clemens, on the other hand, was conservative, dainty, cultured, spiritual. He adored her as little less than a saint, and she became, indeed, his saving grace. She had all the personal refinement which he lacked, and she undertook the work of polishing and purifying her life companion. She had no wish to destroy his personality, to make him over, but only to preserve his best, and she set about it in the right way, gently, and with a tender gratitude in each achievement. She did not entirely approve of certain lines of his reading, or, rather, she did not understand them in those days. That he should be fond of history and the sciences was natural enough, but when the life of P. T. Barnum, written by himself, appeared, and he sat up nights to absorb it, and woke early and lighted the lamp to follow the career of the great showman, she was at a loss to comprehend this particular literary passion, and indeed was rather jealous of it. She did not realize then his vast interest in the study of human nature, or that such a book contained what Mr. Howells calls the root of the human matter, the inner revelation of the human being at first hand. Concerning his religious observances, her task in the beginning was easy enough. Clemens had not at that time formulated any particular doctrines of his own. His natural kindness of heart, and especially his love for his wife, inclined him toward the teachings and customs of her Christian faith. Unorthodox but sincere as Christianity in the Langdon family was likely to be, it took very little persuasion on his wife's part to establish family prayers in their home, grace before meals, and the morning reading of a Bible chapter. Joe Goodman, who made a trip East and visited them during the early days of their married life, was dumbfounded to see Mark Twain ask a blessing and join in family worship. Just how long these forms continued cannot be known today. The time of their abandonment has perished from the recollections of any one now living. It would seem to have been the Bible reading that wrought the change. The prayer and the blessing were to him sincere and gracious, but as the readings continued he realized that he had never before considered the Bible from a doctrinal point of view, as a guide to spiritual salvation. To his logical reasoning mind a large portion of it seemed absurd, a mass of fables and traditions, mere mythology. From such material humanity had built its mightiest edifice of hope, the doctrines of its faith. After a little while he could stand it no longer. "Livy," he said one day, "you may keep this up if you want to, but I must ask you to excuse me from it. It is making me a hypocrite. I don't believe in this Bible. It contradicts my reason. I can't sit here and listen to it, letting you believe that I regard it, as you do, in the light of gospel, the Word of God." He was moved to write an article on the human idea of God, ancient and modern. It contained these paragraphs: "The difference in importance between the God of the Bible and the God of the present day cannot be described. It can only be vaguely and inadequately figured to the mind. If you make figures to represent the earth and moon, and allow a space of 1 inch between them, to represent the 400,000 miles of distance which lies between the two bodies, the map will have to be 11 miles long in order to bring in the nearest fixed star." His figures were far too small. A map drawn on the scale of 400,000 miles to the inch would need to be 1,100 miles long to take in both the earth and the nearest fixed star. On such a map the earth would be 1/50th of an inch in diameter, the size of a small grain of sand. "So one cannot put the modern heavens on a map, nor the modern God, but the Bible God and the Bible heavens can be set down on a slate, and yet not be discommoded. The difference between that universe and the modern one revealed by science is as the difference between a dust-flecked ray in a barn and the sublime arch of the Milky Way in the skies. Its God was strictly proportioned to its dimensions. His sole solicitude was about a handful of truculent nomads. He worried and fretted over them in a peculiarly and distractingly human way. One day he coaxed and petted them beyond their due. The next he harried and lashed them beyond their deserts. He sulked, he cursed, he raged, he grieved, according to his mood and the circumstances, but all to no purpose. His efforts were all vain. He could not govern them. When the fury was on him he was blind to all reason. He not only slaughtered the offender, but even his harmless little children and dumb cattle. To trust the God of the Bible is to trust an irascible, vindictive, fierce, and ever fickle and changeful master. To trust the true God is to trust a being who has uttered no promises, but whose beneficent, exact, and changeless ordering of the machinery of his colossal universe is proof that he is at least steadfast to his purposes. whose unwritten laws, so far as they affect man, being equal and impartial, show that he is just and fair. These things, taken together, suggest that if he shall ordain us to live hereafter, he will still be steadfast, just, and fair toward us. We shall not need to require anything more. It seems mild enough, obvious, even orthodox now, so far have we traveled in 40 years. But such a declaration then would have shocked a great number of sincerely devout persons. His wife prevailed upon him not to print it. She respected his honesty, even his reasoning, but his doubts were a long grief to her, nevertheless. In time she saw more clearly with his vision, but this was long after, when she had lived more with the world, had become more familiar with its larger needs and the proportions of created things. They did not mingle much or long with the social life of Buffalo. They received and returned calls, attended an occasional reception, but neither of them found such things especially attractive in those days, so they remained more and more in their own environment. There is an anecdote which seems to belong here. One Sunday morning Clemens noticed smoke pouring from the upper window of the house across the street. The owner and his wife, comparatively newcomers, were seated upon the veranda, evidently not aware of impending danger. The Clemens household thus far had delayed calling on them, but Clemens himself now stepped briskly across the street. Bowing with leisurely politeness, he said, "My name is Clemens. We ought to have called on you before, and I beg your pardon for intruding now in this informal way, but your house is on fire." Almost the only intimate friends they had in Buffalo were in the family of David Gray, the poet editor of the Courier. Gray was a gentle, lovable man, the gentlest spirit and the loveliest that ever went clothed in clay since Sir Galahad laid him to rest, Mark Twain once said of him. Both Gray and Clemens were friends of John Hay, and their families soon became intimate. Perhaps, in time, the Clemens household would have found other as good friends in the Buffalo circles, but heavy clouds that had lain unseen just beyond the horizon during those earlier months of marriage rose suddenly into view, and the social life, whatever it might have become, was no longer a consideration. End of Chapter 78. The Primrose Path. Read by John Greenman. This is section 79 of Mark Twain, a Biography. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mark Twain, a Biography, Volume 1, Part 2, 1866 to 1875. Chapter 79, The Old Human Story. Jervis Langdon was never able to accept his son-in-law's invitation to the new home. His health began to fail that spring, and at the end of March, with his physician and Mrs. Langdon, he made a trip to the South. In a letter written at Richmond he said, "I have thrown off all care," and named a list of the 4 great interests in which he was involved. Under number 5 he included "everything," adding, "So you see how good I am to follow the counsel of my children." He closed, "Samuel, I love your wife and she loves me. I think it is only fair that you should know it, but you need not flare up. I loved her before you did, and she loved me before she did you, and has not ceased since. I see no way but for you to make the most of it." He was already a very ill man, and this cheerful letter was among the last he ever wrote. He was absent 6 weeks, and seemed to improve, but suffered an attack early in May. In June his condition became critical. Clemens and his wife were summoned to Elmira, and joined in the nursing day and night. Clemens surprised everyone by his ability as a nurse. His delicacy and thoughtfulness were unfailing. His original ways of doing things always amused and interested the patient. In later years Mark Twain once said: "How much of the nursing did I do? My main watch was from midnight to 4 in the morning, nearly 4 hours. My other watch was a midday watch, and I think it was nearly 3 hours. The two sisters divided the remaining 17 hours of the 24 hours between them, and each of them tried generously and persistently to swindle the other out of a part of her watch. I went to bed early every night, and tried to get sleep enough by midnight to fit me for my work, but it was always a failure. I went on watch sleepy, and remained miserable, sleepy, and wretched straight along through the 4 hours. I can still see myself sitting by that bed in the melancholy stillness of the sweltering night, mechanically waving a palm leaf fan over the drawn, white face of the patient. I can still recall my noddings, my fleeting unconsciousness, when the fan would come to a standstill in my hand, and I woke up with a start and a hideous shock. During all that dreary time I began to watch for the dawn long before it came. When the first faint gray showed through the window blinds I felt as no doubt a castaway feels when the dim threads of the looked for ship appear against the sky. I was well and strong, but I was a man afflicted with a man's infirmity lack of endurance." He always dealt with himself in this unsparing way, but those who were about him then have left a different story. It was all without avail. Mr. Langdon rallied, and early in July there was hope for his recovery. He failed again, and on the afternoon of the 6th of August he died. To Mrs. Clemens, delicate and greatly worn with the anxiety and strain of watching, the blow was a crushing one. It was the beginning of a series of disasters which would mark the entire remaining period of their Buffalo residence. There had been a partial plan for spending the summer in England, and a more definite one for joining the Twichells in the Adirondacks. Both of these projects were now abandoned. Mrs. Clemens concluded that she would be better at home than anywhere else, and invited an old school friend, a Miss Emma Nye, to visit her. But the shadow of death had not been lifted from the Clemens household. Miss Nye presently fell ill with typhoid fever. There followed another long period of anxiety and nursing, ending with the death of the visitor in the new home, September 29th. The young wife was now in very delicate health, genuinely ill, in fact. The happy home had become a place of sorrow, of troubled nights and days. Another friend came to cheer them, and on this friend's departure Mrs. Clemens drove to the railway station. It was a hurried trip over rough streets to catch the train. She was prostrated on her return, and a little later, November 7, 1870, her first child, Langdon, was prematurely born. A dangerous illness followed, and complete recovery was long delayed. But on the 12th the crisis seemed past, and the new father wrote a playful letter to the Twichells as coming from the late arrival. Dear Uncle and Aunt, I came into the world on the 7th inst., and consequently am about 5 days old now. I have had wretched health ever since I made my appearance. I am not corpulent, nor am I robust in any way. At birth I only weighed 4½ pounds with my clothes on, and the clothes were the chief feature of the weight, too, I am obliged to confess. But I am doing finely, all things considered. My little mother is very bright and cheery, and I guess she is pretty happy, but I don't know what about. She laughs a great deal, notwithstanding she is sick abed. P.S. Father says I had better write, because you will be more interested in me just now than in the rest of the family. A week later Clemens, as himself, wrote: Livy is up, and the Prince keeps her busy and anxious these latter days and nights, but I am a bachelor upstairs and don't have to jump up and get the soothing syrup, though I would as soon do it as not, I assure you. Livy will be certain to read this letter. Tell Harmony that I do hold the baby, and do it pretty handily, too, though with occasional apprehensions that his loose head will fall off. I don't have to quiet him, he hardly ever utters a cry. He is always thinking about something. He is a patient, good little baby. Further along he refers to one of his reforms. Smoke? I always smoke from 3 till 5 on Sunday afternoons, and in New York the other day I smoked a week, day and night. But when Livy is well I smoke only those 2 hours on Sunday. I'm boss of the habit now, and shall never let it boss me any more. Originally I quit solely on Livy's account. Not that I believed there was the faintest reason in the matter, but just as I would deprive myself of sugar in my coffee if she wished it, or quit wearing socks if she thought them immoral. And I stick to it yet on Livy's account, and shall always continue to do so without a pang. But somehow it seems a pity that you quit, for Mrs. T. didn't mind it, if I remember rightly. Ah, it is turning one's back upon a kindly Providence to spurn away from us the good creature he sent to make the breath of life a luxury as well as a necessity, enjoyable as well as useful. To go quit smoking when there ain't any sufficient excuse for it, why, my old boy, when they used to tell me I would shorten my life 10 years by smoking, they little knew the devotee they were wasting their puerile words upon. They little knew how trivial and valueless I would regard a decade that had no smoking in it. But I won't persuade you, Twichell. I won't until I see you again. But then we'll smoke for a week together, and then shut off again. End of Chapter 79. The Old Human Story. Read by John Greenman. This is section 80 of Mark Twain, a Biography. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mark Twain, a Biography. Volume 1, Part 2, 1866 to 1875. Chapter 80. Literary Projects. The success of The Innocents naturally made a thrifty publisher like Bliss anxious for a second experiment. He had begun early in the year to talk about another book, but nothing had come of it beyond a project or two, more or less hazy and unpursued. Clemens at one time developed a plan for a Noah's Ark book, which was to detail the cruise of the Ark in diaries kept by various members of it Shem, Ham, and the others. He really wrote some of it at the time, and it was an idea he never entirely lost track of. All along among his manuscripts appear fragments from those ancient voyagers. One of the earlier entries will show the style and purpose of the undertaking. It is from Shem's record. Friday. Papa's birthday. He is 600 years old. He celebrated it in a big black tent. Principal men of the tribe present. Afterward they were shown over the ark, which was looking desolate and empty and dreary on account of a misunderstanding with the workmen about wages. Methuselah was as free with his criticisms as usual, and as voluble and familiar, which I and my brothers do not like, for we are past our 100th year and married. He still calls me Shemmy, just as he did when I was a child of 60. I am still but a youth, it is true, but youth has its feelings, and I do not like this. Saturday. Keeping the Sabbath. Sunday. Papa has yielded the advance, and everybody is hard at work. The shipyard is so crowded that the men hinder each other, everybody hurrying or being hurried. The rush and confusion and shouting and wrangling are astonishing to our family, who have always been used to a quiet country life. It was from this germ that in a later day grew the diaries of Adam and Eve, though nothing very satisfactory ever came of this preliminary attempt. The author had faith in it, however. To Bliss he wrote: I mean to take plenty of time and pains with a Noah's Ark book. Maybe it will be several years before it is all written, but it will be a perfect lightning striker when it is done. You can have the first say, that is plain enough, on that or any other book I may prepare for the press, as long as you deal in a fair, open, and honorable way with me. I do not think you will ever find me doing otherwise with you. I can get a book ready for you any time you want it, but you can't want one before this time next year, so I have plenty of time. Bliss was only temporarily appeased. He realized that to get a book ready by the time he wanted it, a book of sufficient size and importance to maintain the pace set by the Innocents, meant rather more immediate action than his author seemed to contemplate. Furthermore, he knew that other publishers were besieging the author of the Innocents, a disquieting thought. In early July, when Mr. Langdon's condition had temporarily improved, Bliss had come to Elmira and proposed a book which should relate the author's travels and experiences in the Far West. It was an inviting subject, and Clemens, by this time more attracted by the idea of authorship and its rewards, readily enough agreed to undertake the volume. He had been offered half profits, and suggested that the new contract be arranged upon these terms. Bliss, figuring on a sale of 100,000 copies, proposed 7½ % royalty as an equivalent, and the contract was so arranged. In after years, when the cost of manufacture and paper had become greatly reduced, Clemens, with but a confused notion of business details, believed he had been misled by Bliss in this contract, and was bitter and resentful accordingly. The figures remain, however, to show that Bliss dealt fairly. 7½ % of a subscription book did represent half profits up to 100,000 copies when the contract was drawn, but it required 10 years to sell that quantity, and in that time conditions had changed. Bliss could hardly foresee that these things would be so, and as he was dead when the book touched the 100,000 mark, he could not explain or readjust matters, whatever might have been his inclination. Clemens was pleased enough with the contract when it was made. To Orion he wrote July 15, 1870: Per contract I must have another 600-page book ready for my publisher January 1st, and I only began it to day. The subject of it is a secret, because I may possibly change it, but as it stands I propose to do up Nevada and California, beginning with the trip across the country in the stage. Have you a memorandum of the route we took, or the names of any of the stations we stopped at? Do you remember any of the scenes, names, incidents, or adventures of the coach trip? For I remember next to nothing about the matter. Jot down a foolscap page of items for me. I wish I could have 2 days' talk with you. I suppose I am to get the biggest copyright this time ever paid on a subscription book in this country. The work, so promptly begun, made little progress. Hard days of illness and sorrow followed, and it was not until September that it was really under way. His natural enthusiasm over any new undertaking possessed him. On the 4th he wrote Bliss: During the past week I have written the first 4 chapters of the book, and I tell you the Innocents Abroad will have to get up early to beat it. It will be a book that will jump straight into continental celebrity the first month it is issued. He prophesied a sale of 90,000 copies during the first 12 months, and declared, I see the capabilities of the subject. But further disasters, even then impending, made continued effort impossible. The prospect of the new book for a time became gloomy, the idea of it less inspiring. Other plans presented themselves, and at one time he thought of letting the Galaxy publishers get out a volume of his sketches. In October he wrote Bliss that he was driveling along tolerably fair on the book, getting off from 12 to 20 pages of manuscript a day. Bliss naturally discouraged the Galaxy idea, and realizing that the new book might be long delayed, agreed to get out a volume of miscellany sufficiently large and important for subscription sales. He was doubtful of the wisdom of this plan, and when Clemens suddenly proposed a brand new scheme, his publisher very readily agreed to hold back the publication of sketches indefinitely. The new book was to be adventures in the diamond mines of South Africa, then newly opened and of wide public interest. Clemens did not propose to visit the mines himself, but to let another man do the traveling, make the notes, and write or tell him the story, after which Clemens would enlarge and elaborate it in his own fashion. His adaptation of the letters of Professor Ford a year earlier had convinced him that his plan would work out successfully on a larger scale. He fixed upon his old friend J. H. Riley of Washington, Riley newspaper correspondent (see Sketches), earlier of San Francisco, as the proper person to do the traveling. At the end of November he wrote Bliss: I have put my greedy hands upon the best man in America for my purpose, and shall start him to the diamond field in South Africa within a fortnight at my expense, that the book will have a perfectly beautiful sale. He suggested that Bliss advance Riley's expense money, the amount to be deducted from the first royalty returns. Also he proposed an increased royalty, probably in view of the startling splendor of the new idea. Bliss was duly impressed, and the agreement was finally made on a basis of 8½ %, with an advance royalty sufficient to see Riley to South Africa and return. Clemens had not yet heard from Riley definitely when he wrote his glowing letter to Bliss. He took it for granted that Riley, always an adventurous sort, would go. When Riley wrote him that he felt morally bound to the Alta, of which he was then Washington correspondent, also in certain other directions till the end of the session, Clemens wrote him at great length, detailing his scheme in full and urging him to write instantly to the Alta and others, asking a release on the ground of being offered a rare opportunity to improve his fortunes. You know right well that I would not have you depart a hair from any obligation for any money. The boundless confidence that I have in you is born of a conviction of your integrity in small as well as in great things. I know plenty of men whose integrity I would trust to here, but not off yonder in Africa. His proposal in brief to Riley was that the latter should make the trip to Africa without expense to himself, collect memoranda, and such diamond mines as might be found lying about handy. Upon his return he was to take up temporary residence in the Clemens household until the book was finished, after which large benefits were to accrue to everybody concerned. In the end Riley obtained a release from his obligations and was off for the diamond mines and fortune. Poor fellow! He was faithful in his mission, and it is said that he really located a mining claim that would have made him and his independent for all time to come. But returning home with his precious memoranda and the news of good fortune, he accidentally wounded himself with a fork while eating. Blood poisoning set in, they called it cancer then, and he was only able to get home to die. His memoranda were never used, his mining claim was never identified. Certainly death was closely associated with Mark Twain's fortunes during those earlier days of his married life. On the whole, the Buffalo residence was mainly a gloomy one. Its ventures were attended by ill fortune. For some reason Mark Twain's connection with the Express, while it had given the paper a wide reputation, had not largely increased its subscription. Perhaps his work on it was too varied and erratic. Nasby, who had popularized the Toledo Blade, kept steadily to one line. His farmer public knew always just what to expect when their weekly edition arrived. Clemens and his wife dreamed of a new habitation, and new faces and surroundings. They agreed to offer their home and his interests in the Express for sale. They began to talk of Hartford, where Twichell lived, and where Orion Clemens and his wife had recently located. Mark Twain's new fortunes had wrought changes in the affairs of his relatives. Already, before his marriage, he had prospected towns here and there with a view to finding an Eastern residence for his mother and sister, and he had kept Orion's welfare always in mind. When Pamela and her daughter came to his wedding, he told them of a little city by the name of Fredonia, New York, not far from Buffalo, where he thought they might find a pleasant home. "I went in there by night and out by night," he said, "so I saw none of it, but I had an intelligent, attractive audience. Prospect Fredonia, and let me know what it is like. Try to select a place where a good many funerals pass. Ma likes funerals. If you can pick a good funeral corner she will be happy." It was in her later life that Jane Clemens had developed this particular passion. She would consult the morning paper for any notice of obsequies, and attend those that were easy of access. Watching the processions go by gave her a peculiar joy. Mrs. Moffett and her daughter did go to Fredonia immediately following the wedding. They found it residentially attractive, and rented a house before returning to St. Louis, a promptness that somewhat alarmed the old lady, who did not altogether fancy the idea of being suddenly set down in a strange house in a strange land, even though it would be within hailing distance of Sam and his new wife. Perhaps the Fredonia funerals were sufficiently numerous and attractive, for she soon became attached to the place, and entered into the spirit of the life there, joining its temperance crusades and the like, with zest and enjoyment. Orion remained in St. Louis, but when Bliss established a paper called the Publisher and wanted an editor, he was chosen for the place, originally offered to his brother. The latter, writing to Orion, said: "If you take the place with an air of perfect confidence in yourself, never once letting anything show in your bearing but a quiet, modest, entire, and perfect confidence in your ability to do pretty much anything in the world, Bliss will think you are the very man he needs. But don't show any shadow of timidity or unsoldierly diffidence, for that sort of thing is fatal to advancement. I warn you thus because you are naturally given to knocking your pot over in this way when a little judicious conduct would make it boil." End of Chapter 80, Literary Projects, read by John Greenman. This is Section 81 of Mark Twain, a Biography. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mark Twain, a Biography, Volume 1, Part 2, 1866 to 1875. Chapter 81, Some Further Literary Matters. Meantime, The Innocents Abroad had continued to prosper. Its author ranked mainly as a humorist, but of such colossal proportions that his contemporaries had seemed to dwindle. The mighty note of the Frog of Calaveras had dwarfed a score of smaller peepers. At the end of a year from its date of publication the book had sold up to 67,000, and was continuing at the rate of several thousand monthly. "You are running it in staving, tip-top, first-class style," Clemens wrote to Bliss. "On the average 10 people a day come and hunt me up to tell me I am a benefactor. I guess that is a part of the program we didn't expect in the first place." Apparently the book appealed to readers of every grade. 115 copies were in constant circulation at the Mercantile Library in New York, while in the most remote cabins of America it was read and quoted. Jack Van Nostrand, making a long horseback tour of Colorado, wrote: "I stopped a week ago in a ranch but 100 miles from nowhere. The occupant had just 2 books, the Bible and The Innocents Abroad, the former in good repair." Across the ocean the book had found no less favor, and was being translated into many and strange tongues. By what seems now some veritable magic, its author's fame had become literally universal. The consul at Hongkong, discussing English literature with a Chinese acquaintance, a Mandarin, mentioned The Pilgrim's Progress. "Yes, indeed, I have read it," the Mandarin said eagerly. "We are enjoying it in China, and shall have it soon in our own language. It is by Mark Twain." In England the book had an amazing vogue from the beginning, and English readers were endeavoring to outdo the Americans in appreciation. Indeed, as a rule, English readers of culture, critical readers, rose to an understanding of Mark Twain's literary value with greater promptness than did the same class of readers at home. There were exceptions, of course. There were English critics who did not take Mark Twain seriously. There were American critics who did. Among the latter was a certain William Ward, an editor of a paper down in Macon, Georgia, The Beacon. Ward did not hold a place with the great magazine arbiters of literary rank. He was only an obscure country editor, but he wrote like a prophet. His article, too long to quote in full, concerned American humorists in general, from Washington Irving through John Phoenix, Philander Doestrix, Sut Lovingwood, Artemus Ward, Josh Billings, and Petroleum V. Nasby, down to Mark Twain. With the exception of the first and last named, he says of them: "They have all had and will have their day. Some of them are resting beneath the sod, and others still live whose work will scarcely survive them. Since Irving, no humorist in prose has held the foundation of a permanent fame except it be Mark Twain, and this, as in the case of Irving, is because he is a pure writer. Aside from any subtle mirth that lurks through his composition, the grace and finish of his more didactic and descriptive sentences indicate more than mediocrity. The writer then refers to Mark Twain's description of the Sphinx, comparing it with Bulwer's, which he thinks may have influenced it. He was mistaken in this, for Clemens had not read Bulwer, never could read him at any length. Of the English opinions, that of the Saturday Review was perhaps most doubtful. It came along late in 1870, and would hardly be worth recalling if it were not for a resulting or collateral interest. Clemens saw notice of this review before he saw the review itself. A paragraph in the Boston Advertiser spoke of the Saturday Review as treating the absurdities of the Innocents from a serious standpoint. The paragraph closed: "We can imagine the delight of the humorist in reading this tribute to his power, and indeed it is so amusing in itself that he can hardly do better than reproduce the article in full in his next monthly memoranda." The old temptation to hoax his readers prompted Mark Twain to reproduce in the Galaxy, not the review article, which he had not yet seen, but an imaginary review article, an article in which the imaginary reviewer would be utterly devoid of any sense of humor and treat the most absurd incidents of the New Pilgrim's Progress as if set down by the author in solemn and serious earnest. The pretended review began: "Lord Macaulay died too soon. We never felt this so deeply as when we finished the last chapter of the above named extravagant work. Macaulay died too soon, for none but he could mete out complete and comprehensive justice to the insolence, the impudence, the presumption, the mendacity, and, above all, the majestic ignorance of this author." The review goes on to cite cases of the author's gross deception. It says: "Let the cultivated English student of human nature picture to himself this Mark Twain as a person capable of doing the following described things, and not only doing them, but, with incredible innocence, printing them tranquilly and calmly in a book. For instance, he states that he entered a hairdresser's in Paris to get a shave, and the first rake the barber gave him with his razor it loosened his hide and lifted him out of the chair. This is unquestionably extravagant. In Florence he was so annoyed by beggars that he pretends to have seized and eaten one in a frantic spirit of revenge. There is, of course, no truth in this. He gives at full length the theatrical program 17 or 1800 years old, which he professes to have found in the ruins of the Colosseum, among the dirt and mold and rubbish. It is a sufficient comment upon this subject to remark that even a cast-iron program would not have lasted so long under the circumstances." There were 2½ pages of this really delightful burlesque which the author had written with huge enjoyment, partly as a joke on the review, partly to trick American editors, who he believed would accept it as a fresh and startling proof of the traditional English lack of humor. But as in early sagebrush hoaxes, he rather overdid the thing. Readers and editors readily enough accepted it as genuine so far as having come from the Saturday Review, but most of them regarded it as a delicious bit of humor which Mark Twain himself had taken seriously, and was therefore the one sold. This was certainly startling, and by no means gratifying. In the next issue he undertook that saddest of all performances with tongue or pen. He explained his joke, and insisted on the truth of the explanation. Then he said: "If any man doubts my word now, I will kill him. No, I will not kill him. I will win his money. I will bet him 20 to 1 and let any New York publisher hold the stakes that the statements I have above made as to the authorship of the article in question are entirely true." But the Cincinnati Enquirer persisted in continuing the joke, in "rubbing it in," as we say now. The Enquirer declared that Mark Twain had been intensely mortified at having been so badly taken in, that his explanation in the Galaxy was ingenious but unfortunately not true. The Enquirer maintained that the Saturday Review of October 8, 1870, did contain the article exactly as printed in the memoranda, and advised Mark Twain to admit that he was sold, and say no more about it. This was enraging. Mark Twain had his own ideas as to how far a joke might be carried without violence, and this was a good way beyond the limits. He denounced the Enquirer's statement as a pitiful, deliberate falsehood, in his anger falling into the old-time phrasing of newspaper editorial abuse. He offered to bet them $1,000 in cash that they could not prove their assertions, and asked pointedly, in conclusion, "Will they swallow that falsehood ignominiously, or will they send an agent to the Galaxy office? I think the Cincinnati Enquirer must be edited by children." He promised that if they did not accept his financial proposition he would expose them in the next issue. The incident closed there. He was prevented, by illness in his household, from contributing to the next issue, and the second issue following was his final memoranda installment. So the matter perished and was forgotten. It was his last editorial hoax. Perhaps he concluded that hoaxes in any form were dangerous playthings. They were too likely to go off at the wrong end. It was with the April number, 1871, that he concluded his relations with the Galaxy. In a brief valedictory he gave his reasons. "I have now written for the Galaxy a year. For the last 8 months, with hardly an interval, I have had for my fellows and comrades, night and day, doctors and watchers of the sick. During these 8 months death has taken 2 members of my home circle, and malignantly threatened 2 others. All this I have experienced, yet all the time have been under contract to furnish humorous matter once a month for this magazine. I am speaking the exact truth in the above details. Please to put yourself in my place and contemplate the grisly grotesqueness of the situation. I think that some of the humor I have written during this period could have been injected into a funeral sermon without disturbing the solemnity of the occasion. The memoranda will cease permanently with this issue of the magazine. To be a pirate on a low salary, with no share in the profits of the business, used to be my idea of an uncomfortable occupation, but I have other views now. To be a monthly humorist in a cheerless time is drearier. Without doubt he felt a glad relief in being rid of this recurrent, imperative demand. He wrote to Orion that he had told the Galaxy people he would not write another article, long or short, for less than $500, and preferred not to do it at all. The Galaxy department and the work on the Express were Mark Twain's farewell to journalism, for the memoranda was essentially journalistic, almost as much so, and as liberally, as his old-time Enterprise position. Apparently he wrote with absolute freedom, unhampered by editorial policy or restriction. The result was not always pleasant, and it was not always refined. We may be certain that it was because of Mrs. Clemens's heavy burdens that year, and her consequent inability to exert a beneficent censorship, that more than a dozen, of the memoranda contributions were permitted to see the light of print. As a whole, the literary result of Mark Twain's Buffalo period does not reach the high standard of the Innocents Abroad. It was a retrogression, in some measure a return to his earlier form. It had been done under pressure, under heavy stress of mind, as he said. Also there was another reason. Neither the subject treated nor the environment of labor had afforded that lofty inspiration which glorified every step of the Quaker City journey. Buffalo was a progressive city, a beautiful city as American cities go, but it was hardly an inspiring city for literature, and a dull, dingy newspaper office was far, very far, from the pleasant decks of the Quaker City, the camp fires of Syria, the blue sky and sea of the Mediterranean. End of Chapter 81. Some further literary matters. Read by John Greenman. This is section 82 of Mark Twain, a Biography. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mark Twain, a Biography. Volume 1, Part 2, 1866 to 1875. Chapter 82. The Writing of Roughing It. The third book published by Mark Twain was not the Western book he was preparing for Bliss. It was a small volume, issued by Sheldon & Company, entitled Mark Twain's Autobiography, Burlesque, and First Romance. The romance was the awful, terrible, medieval romance which had appeared in the Express at the beginning of 1870. The burlesque autobiography had not previously appeared. The two made a thin little book, which, in addition to its literary features, had running through it a series of full-page, irrelevant pictures, cartoons of the Erie Railroad ring, presented as illustrations of a slightly modified version of the house that Jack built. The house was the Erie headquarters, the purpose being to illustrate the swindling methods of the ring. The faces of Jay Gould, James Fisk, Jr., John T. Hoffman, and others of the combination are chiefly conspicuous. The publication was not important from any standpoint. Literary burlesque is rarely important, and it was far from Mark Twain's best form of expression. A year or two later he realized the mistake of this book, bought in the plates, and destroyed them. Meantime the new Western book was at a standstill. To Orion, in March, he wrote: I am still nursing Livy night and day. I am nearly worn out. We shall go to Elmira 10 days hence, if Livy can travel on a mattress then, and stay there until I finish the California book, say 3 months. But I can't begin work right away when I get there. Must have a week's rest, for I have been through 30 days' terrific siege. He promised to forward some of the manuscript soon. Hold on 4 or 5 days, and I will see if I can get a few chapters fixed to send to Bliss. I have offered this house and the Express for sale, and when we go to Elmira we leave here for good. I shall not select a new home till the book is finished, but we have little doubt that Hartford will be the place. He disposed of his interest in the Express in April, at a sacrifice of $10,000 on the purchase price. Mrs. Clemens and the baby were able to travel, and without further delay he took them to Elmira, to Quarry Farm. Quarry Farm, the home of Mrs. Clemens's sister, Mrs. Theodore Crane, is a beautiful hilltop with a wide green slope overlooking the hazy city and the Chemung River, beyond which are the distant hills. It was bought quite incidentally by Mr. and Mrs. Langdon, who, driving by one evening, stopped to water the horses and decided that it would make a happy summer retreat, where the families could combine their housekeeping arrangements during vacation days. When the place had first been purchased they had debated on a name for it. They had tried several, among them Go as You Please Hall, Crane's Nest, and had finally agreed upon Rest and Be Thankful, but this was only its official name. There was an abandoned quarry up the hill, a little way from the house, and the title suggested by Thomas K. Beecher came more naturally to the tongue. The place became Quarry Farm, and so remains. Clemens and his wife had fully made up their minds to live in Hartford. They had both conceived an affection for the place, Clemens mainly because of Twichell, while both of them yearned for the congenial literary and social atmosphere and the welcome which they felt awaited them. Hartford was precisely what Buffalo in that day was not, a home for the literary man. It held a distinguished group of writers, most of whom the Clemenses already knew. Furthermore, with Bliss as publisher of the Mark Twain books, it held their chief business interests. Their plans for going were not very definite as to time. Clemens found that his work went better at the farm, and that Mrs. Clemens and the delicate baby daily improved. They decided to remain at Quarry Farm for the summer, their first summer in that beautiful place which would mean so much to them in the years to come. It was really Joe Goodman, as much as anything, that stirred a fresh enthusiasm in the book. Goodman arrived just when the author's spirits were at low ebb. "Joe," he said, "I guess I'm done for. I don't appear to be able to get along at all with my work, and what I do write does not seem valuable. I'm afraid I'll never be able to reach the standard of The Innocents Abroad again. Here is what I've written, Joe. Read it and see if that is your opinion." Goodman took the manuscript and seated himself in a chair, while Clemens went over to a table and pretended to work. Goodman read page after page, critically, and was presently absorbed in it. Clemens watched him furtively till he could stand it no longer. Then he threw down his pen, exclaiming, "I knew it! I knew it! I am writing nothing but rot. You have sat there all this time reading without a smile, and pitying the ass I am making of myself. But I am not wholly to blame. I am not strong enough to fight against fate. I have been trying to write a funny book, with dead people and sickness everywhere. Mr. Langdon died first, then a young lady in our house, and now Mrs. Clemens and the baby have been at the point of death all winter. Oh, Joe, I wish to God I could die myself." "Mark," said Joe, "I was reading critically, not for amusement, and so far as I have read, and can judge, this is one of the best things you have ever written. I have found it perfectly absorbing. You are doing a great book." Clemens knew that Goodman never spoke except from conviction, and the verdict was to him like a message of life handed down by an archangel. He was a changed man instantly. He was all enthusiasm, full of his subject, eager to go on. He proposed to pay Goodman a salary to stay there and keep him company and furnish him with inspiration, the Pacific Coast atmosphere and vernacular, which he feared had slipped away from him. Goodman declined the salary, but extended his visit as long as his plans would permit, and the two had a happy time together, recalling old Comstock days. Every morning, for a month or more, they used to tramp over the farm. They fell into the habit of visiting the old quarry and pawing over the fragments in search of fossil specimens. Both of them had a poetic interest in geology, its infinite remoteness, and its testimonies. Without scientific knowledge, they took a deep pleasure in accumulating a collection, which they arranged on boards torn from an old fence. until they had enough specimens to fill a small museum. They imagined they could distinguish certain geological relations and families, and would talk about trilobites, the old red sandstone period, and the Azoic age, or follow random speculation to far lying conclusions, developing vague humors of phrase and fancy, having altogether a joyful good time. Another interest that developed during Goodman's stay was in one Ruloff, who was under death sentence for a particularly atrocious murder. The papers were full of Ruloff's prodigious learning. It was said that he had in preparation a work showing the unity of all languages. Goodman and Clemens agreed that Ruloff's death would be a great loss to mankind, even though he was clearly a villain and deserved his sentence. They decided that justice would be served just as well if some stupid person were hung in his place, and following out his fancy, Clemens one morning put aside his regular work and wrote an article to the Tribune offering to supply a substitute for Ruloff. He signed it simply Samuel Langhorne, and it was published as a serious communication, without comment, so far as the Tribune was concerned. Other papers, however, took it up, and it was widely copied and commented upon. Apparently no one ever identified Mark Twain with the authorship of the letter, which, by the way, does not appear to have prolonged Ruloff's earthly usefulness. The reader will find the Ruloff letter in full under Appendix K at the end of last volume. Life at the farm may have furnished agricultural inspiration, for Clemens wrote something about Horace Greeley's farming, also a skit concerning Henry Ward Beecher's efforts in that direction. Of Mr. Beecher's farming he said, "His strawberries would be a comfortable success if robins would eat turnips." The article amused Beecher, and perhaps Greeley was amused, too, for he wrote: "Mark, you are mistaken as to my criticisms on your farming. I never publicly made any, while you have undertaken to tell the exact cost per pint of my potatoes and cabbages, truly enough the inspiration of genius. If you will really betake yourself to farming, or even to telling what you know about it, rather than what you don't know about mine, I will not only refrain from disparaging criticism, but will give you my blessing. Yours, Horace Greeley." The letter is in Mr. Greeley's characteristic scrawl, and no doubt furnished inspiration for the turnip story in Roughing It, also the model for the pretended facsimile of Greeley's writing. Altogether there was a busy, enterprising summer at Quarry Farm. By the middle of May Clemens wrote to Bliss that he had 1,200 manuscript pages of the new book already written, and that he was turning out the remainder at the rate of from 30 to 65 per day. He was in high spirits by this time. The family health had improved, and prospects were bright. "I have enough manuscript on hand now to make, allowing for engravings, about 400 pages of the book, consequently am 2/3 done. I intended to run up to Hartford about the middle of the week and take it along, but I find myself so thoroughly interested in my work now, a thing I have not experienced for months, that I can't bear to lose a single moment of the inspiration. So I will stay here and peg away as long as it lasts. My present idea is to write as much more as I have already written, and then collect from the mass the very best chapters and discard the rest. When I get it done I want to see the man who will begin to read it and not finish it. Nothing grieves me now, nothing troubles me, nothing bothers me or gets my attention. I don't think of anything but the book, and don't have an hour's unhappiness about anything, and don't care 2 cents whether school keeps or not. The book will be done soon now. It will be a starchy book. The dedication will be worth the price of the volume. Thus: To the late Cain this book is dedicated, not on account of respect for his memory, for it merits little respect, not on account of sympathy for him, for his bloody deed places him without the pale of sympathy, strictly speaking, but out of a mere humane commiseration for him, in that it was his misfortune to live in a dark age that knew not the beneficent insanity plea. Probably Mrs. Clemens diverted this picturesque dedication in favor of the Higbee inscription, or perhaps the author never really intended the literary tribute to Cain. The impulse that inspired it, however, was characteristic. In a postscript to this letter he adds: My stock is looking up. I am getting the bulliest offers for books and almanacs, am flooded with lecture invitations, and one periodical offers me $6,000 cash for 12 articles of any length and on any subject, treated humorously or otherwise. He set in to make hay while the sun was shining. In addition to the California book, which was now fast nearing completion, he discussed a scheme with Goodman for a 600-page work which they were to do jointly. He planned and wrote one or two scenes from a Western play to be built from episodes in the new book. One of them was the Arkansas incident, related in Chapter 31. He perfected one of his several inventions, an automatically adjusted vest strap. He wrote a number of sketches, made an occasional business trip to New York and Hartford, prospected the latter place for a new home. The shadow which had hung over the sojourn in Buffalo seemed to have lifted. He had promised Bliss some contributions for his new paper, and in June he sent 3 sketches. In an accompanying letter he says: Here are 3 articles which you may have if you will pay $125 for the lot. If you don't want them I'll sell them to the Galaxy, but not for a cent less than 3 times the money. If you take them, pay 1/10 of the $125 in weekly installments to Orion till he has received it all. He reconsidered his resolution not to lecture again, and closed with Redpath for the coming season. He found himself in a lecture writing fever. He wrote 3 of them in succession, one on Artemus Ward, another on Reminiscences of Some Pleasant Characters I Have Met, and a third one based on chapters from the new book. Of the reminiscence lecture he wrote Redpath: It covers my whole acquaintance, kings, lunatics, idiots, and all. Immediately afterward he wrote that he had prepared still another lecture, title to be announced later. During July I'll decide which one I like best, he said. He instructed Redpath not to make engagements for him to lecture in churches. I never made a success of a lecture in a church yet. People are afraid to laugh in a church. Redpath was having difficulties in arranging a circuit to suit him. Clemens had prejudices against certain towns and localities, prejudices that were likely to change overnight. In August he wrote: Dear Red, I am different from other women. My mind changes oftener. People who have no mind can easily be steadfast and firm, but when a man is loaded down to the guards with it, as I am, every heavy sea of foreboding or inclination, maybe of indolence, shifts the cargo. See? Therefore, if you will notice, One week I am likely to give rigid instructions to confine me to New England, the next week send me to Arizona, the next week withdraw my name, the next week give you full untrammeled swing, and the week following modify it. You must try to keep the run of my mind, Redpath, that is your business, being the agent, and it always was too many for me. Now about the West this week. I am willing that you shall retain all the Western engagements, but what I shall want next week is still with God. Yours, Mark. He was in Hartford when this letter was written, arranging for residence there and the removal of his belongings. He finally leased the fine Hooker house on Ford Street, in that pleasant seclusion known as Nook Farm, the literary part of Hartford, which included the residence of Charles Dudley Warner and Harriet Beecher Stowe. He arranged for possession of the premises October 1st, so the new home was settled upon. Then, learning that Nasby was to be in Boston, he ran over to that city for a few days of recreation after his season's labors. Preparations for removal to Hartford were not delayed. The Buffalo property was disposed of, the furnishings were packed and shipped away. The house, which as bride and groom they had entered so happily, was left empty and deserted, never to be entered by them again. In the year and a half of their occupancy it had seen well nigh all the human round, all that goes to make up the happiness and the sorrow of life. End of Chapter 82. The Writing of Roughing It. Read by John Greenman. This is section 83 of Mark Twain, a Biography. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mark Twain, a Biography. Volume 1, Part 2, 1866 to 1875. Chapter 83. Lecturing Days. Life in Hartford in the autumn of 1871 began in the letter rather than in the spirit. The newcomers were received with a wide, neighborly welcome, but the disorder of establishment and the almost immediate departure of the head of the household on a protracted lecturing tour were disquieting things. The atmosphere of the Clemens home during those early Hartford days gave only a faint promise of its future loveliness. As in a far later period, Mark Twain had resorted to lecturing to pay off debt. He still owed a portion of his share in the Express. Also, he had been obliged to obtain an advance from the lecture bureau. He dreaded, as always, the tedium of travel, the clatter of hotel life, the monotony of entertainment, while, more than most men, he loved the tender luxury of home. It was only that he could not afford to lose the profit offered on the platform. His season opened at Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, October 16th, and his schedule carried him hither and thither, to and fro, over distances that lie between Boston and Chicago. There were opportunities to run into Hartford now and then, when he was not too far away, and in November he lectured there on Artemus Ward. He changed his entertainment at least twice that season. He began with the Reminiscences, the lecture which he said would treat of all those whom he had met, idiots, lunatics, and kings, but he did not like it, or it did not go well. He wrote Redpath of the Artemus Ward address: "It suits me, and I'll never deliver the nasty, nauseous Reminiscences any more." But the Ward lecture was good for little more than a month, for on December 8th he wrote again: "Notify all hands that from this time I shall talk nothing but selections from my forthcoming book, Roughing It. Tried it twice last night. Suits me tip top." And somewhat later: "Had a splendid time with a splendid audience in Indianapolis last night. A perfectly jammed house. just as I have all the time out here. I don't care now to have any appointments canceled. I'll even fetch those Dutch Pennsylvanians with this lecture. Have paid up $4,000 indebtedness. You are the last on my list. Shall begin to pay you in a few days, and then I shall be a free man again. Undoubtedly he reveled in the triumphs of a platform tour, though at no time did he regard it as a pleasure excursion. During those early weeks the proofs of his new book, chasing him from place to place, did not add to his comfort. Still, with large and substantial awards in hand and in prospect, one could endure much. In the neighborhood of Boston there were other compensations. He could spend a good part of his days at the Lyceum headquarters, in School Street, where there was always congenial fellowship. Nasby, Josh Billings, and the rest of the peripatetic group that about the end of the year collected there. Their lectures were never tried immediately in Boston, but in the outlying towns, tried and perfected, or discarded. When the provincial audiences were finally satisfied, then the final test in the Boston Music Hall was made, and if this proved successful the rest of the season was safe. Redpath's lecturers put up at Young's Hotel and spent their days at the bureau, smoking and spinning yarns or talking shop. Early in the evening they scattered to the outlying towns Lowell, Lexington, Concord, New Bedford. There is no such a condition today. Lecturers are few, lecture bureaus obscure. There are no great reputations made on the platform. Neither is there any such distinct group of humorists as the one just mentioned. Humor has become universal since then. Few writers of this age would confess to taking their work so seriously as to be at all times unsmiling in it. Only about as many, in fact, as in that day would confess to taking their work so lightly that they could regard life's sterner phases and philosophies with a smile. Josh Billings was one of the gentlest and loveliest of our pioneers of laughter. The present generation is not overfamiliar even with his name, but both the name and sayings of that quaint soul were on everybody's lips at the time of which we are writing. His true name was Henry W. Shaw, and he was a genuine, smiling philosopher, who might have built up a more permanent and serious reputation had he not been induced to disfigure his maxims with ridiculous spelling in order to popularize them and make them bring a living price. It did not matter much with Nasby's work. An assumed illiteracy belonged with the side of life which he presented. But it is pathetic now to consider some of the really masterly sayings of Josh Billings presented in that uncouth form which was regarded as a part of humor a generation ago. Even the aphorisms that were essentially humorous lose value in that degraded spelling. When a man starts downhill, everything is greased for the occasion, could hardly be improved upon by distorted orthography. And here are a few more gems which have survived that deadly blight. Some folks mistake vivacity for wit, whereas the difference between vivacity and wit is the same as the difference between the lightning bug and the lightning. Don't take the bull by the horns, take him by the tail, then you can let him go when you want to. The difficulty is not that we know so much, but that we know so much that isn't so. Josh Billings, Nasby, and Mark Twain were close friends. They had themselves photographed in a group, and there was always some pleasantry going on among them. Josh Billings once wrote on lecturing, and under the head of Rule 7, which treated of unwisdom of inviting a lecturer to a private house, he said: "Think of asking Mark Twain home with you, for instance. Your good wife has put her house in apple pie order for the occasion. Everything is just in the right place. You don't smoke in your house, never. You don't put your feet on the center table. You don't scatter the newspapers all over the room in utter confusion. Order and economy governs your premises. But if you expect Mark Twain to be happy, or even comfortable, you have got to buy a box of cigars worth at least $17, and you've got to move all the tender things out of your parlor. You've got to scatter all the latest papers around the room careless. You've got to have a pitcher of ice water handy, for Mark is a dry humorist. You've got to catch and tie all your young'uns, het and foot, for Mark loves babies only in theory. You've got to send your favorite cat over to the neighbors and hide your poodle. These are things that have to be done, or Mark will pack his valise with his extry shirt collar and his lecture on the Sandwich Islands and travel around your streets smoking and reading the signs over the store doorways until lecture time begins. As we are not likely to touch upon Mark Twain's lecturing, save only lightly hereafter, it may be as well to say something of his method at this period. At all places visited by lecturers there was a committee, and it was the place of the chairman to introduce the lecturer, a privilege which he valued because it gave him a momentary association with distinction and fame. Clemens was a great disappointment to these officials. He had learned long ago that he could introduce himself more effectively than anyone else. His usual formula was to present himself as the chairman of the committee, introducing the lecturer of the evening. Then, with what was in effect a complete change of personality, to begin the lecture. It was always startling and amusing, always a success, but the papers finally printed this formula, which took the freshness out of it, so that he had to invent others. Sometimes he got up with the frank statement that he was introducing himself, because he had never met anyone who could pay a proper tribute to his talents. But the newspapers printed that, too, and he often rose and began with no introduction at all. Whatever his method of beginning, Mark Twain's procedure probably was the purest exemplification of the platform entertainer's art which this country has ever seen. It was the art that makes you forget the artisanship, the art that made each hearer forget that he was not being personally entertained by a new and marvelous friend who had traveled a long way for his particular benefit. One listener has written that he sat simmering with laughter through what he supposed was the continuation of the introduction, waiting for the traditional lecture to begin, when presently the lecturer, with a bow, disappeared and it was over. The listener looked at his watch. He had been there more than an hour. He thought it could be no more than 10 minutes at most. Many have tried to set down something of the effect his art produced on them, but one may not clearly convey the story of a vanished presence and a silent voice. There were other pleasant associations in Boston. Howells was there, and Aldrich, also Bret Harte, who had finished his triumphal progress across the continent to join the Atlantic group. Clemens appears not to have met Aldrich before, though their acquaintance had begun a year earlier, when Aldrich, as editor of Every Saturday, had commented on a poem entitled "The Three Aces," which had appeared in the Buffalo Express. Aldrich had assumed the poem to be the work of Mark Twain and had characterized it as "a feeble imitation of Bret Harte's Heathen Chinee." Clemens, in a letter, had mildly protested as to the charge of authorship, and Aldrich had promptly printed the letter with apologetic explanation. A playful exchange of personal letters followed, and the beginning of a lifelong friendship. One of the letters has a special interest here. Clemens had followed his protest with an apology for it, asking that no further notice be taken of the matter. Aldrich replied that it was too late to prevent doing him justice, as his explanation was already on the press, but that if Clemens insisted he would withdraw it in the next issue. Clemens then wrote that he did not want it withdrawn, and explained that he hated to be accused of plagiarizing Bret Harte, to whom he was deeply indebted for literary schooling in the California days. Continuing, he said: "Do you know the prettiest fancy and the neatest that ever shot through Harte's brain? It was this: when they were trying to decide upon a vignette cover for the Overland, a grizzly bear, of the arms of the State of California, was chosen. Nall Brothers carved him, and the page was printed with him in it. As a bear he was a success. He was a good bear, but then it was objected he was an objectless bear, a bear that meant nothing, signified nothing, simply stood there snarling over his shoulder at nothing, and was painfully and manifestly a boorish and ill-natured intruder upon the fair page. All hands said that none were satisfied. They hated badly to give him up, and yet they hated as much to have him there when there was no point to him. But presently Harte took a pencil and drew two simple lines under his feet, and behold, he was a magnificent success, the ancient symbol of California savagery, snarling at the approaching type of high and progressive civilization, the first overland locomotive. I just think that was nothing less than an inspiration." The bear was that which has always appeared on the Overland cover. The two lines formed a railway track under his feet. Clemens's original letter contained crude sketches illustrating these things. Among the Boston group was another Californian, Ralph Keeler, an eccentric, gifted, and altogether charming fellow whom Clemens had known on the Pacific slope. Keeler had been adopted by the Boston writers, and was grateful and happy accordingly. He was poor of purse, but inexhaustibly rich in the happier gifts of fortune. He was unfailingly buoyant, light-hearted, and hopeful. On an infinitesimal capital he had made a tour of many lands, and had written of it for the Atlantic. In that charmed circle he was as overflowingly happy as if he had been admitted to the company of the gods. Keeler was affectionately regarded by all who knew him, and he offered a sort of worship in return. He often accompanied Mark Twain on his lecture engagements to the various outlying towns, and Clemens brought him back to his hotel for breakfast, where they had good, enjoyable talks together. Once Keeler came eagerly to the hotel and made his way up to Clemens's room. "Come with me," he said. "Quick!" "What is it? What happened?" "Don't wait to talk. Come with me." They tramped briskly through the streets till they reached the public library, entered, Keeler leading the way, not stopping till he faced a row of shelves filled with books. He pointed at one of them, his face radiant with joy. "Look," he said. "Do you see it?" Clemens looked carefully now, and identified one of the books as a stillborn novel which Keeler had published. "This is a library," said Keeler, eagerly, "and they've got it." His whole being was aglow with the wonder of it. He had been investigating. The library records showed that in the 2 years the book had been there it had been taken out and read 3 times. It never occurred to Clemens even to smile. Knowing Mark Twain, one would guess that his eyes were likely to be filled with tears. In his book about Mark Twain, Howells tells of a luncheon which Keeler gave to his more famous associates Aldrich, Fields, Harte, Clemens, and Howells himself, a merry, informal occasion. Says Howells: "Nothing remains to me of the happy time but a sense of idle and aimless and joyful talk play, beginning and ending nowhere, of eager laughter, of countless good stories from Fields, of a heat lightning shimmer of wit from Aldrich, of an occasional concentration of our joint mockeries upon our host, who took it gladly, and amid the discourse, so little improving, but so full of good fellowship, Bret Harte's leering dramatization of Clemens's mental attitude toward a symposium of Boston illuminates. "Why, fellows," he spluttered, "this is the dream of Mark's life." And I remember the glance from under Clemens's feathery eyebrows which betrayed his enjoyment of the fun. Very likely Keeler gave that luncheon in celebration of his book's triumph. It would be like him. Keeler's end was a mystery. The New York Tribune commissioned him to go to Cuba to report the facts of some Spanish outrages. He sailed from New York in the steamer, and was last seen alive the night before the vessel reached Havana. He had made no secret of his mission, but had discussed it in his frank, innocent way. There were some Spanish military men on the ship. Clemens, commenting on the matter, once said, "It may be that he was not flung into the sea; still the belief was general that that was what had happened." In his book Howells refers to the doubt with which Mark Twain was then received by the polite culture of Boston, which on the other hand accepted Bret Harte as one of its own, forgiving even social shortcomings. The reason is not difficult to understand. Harte had made his appeal with legitimate fiction of the kind which, however fresh in flavor and environment, was of a sort to be measured and classified. Harte spoke a language they could understand. His humor, his pathos, his point of view were all recognizable. It was an art already standardized by a master. It is no reflection on the genius of Bret Harte to liken his splendid achievements to those of Charles Dickens. Much of Harte's work is in no way inferior to that of his great English prototype. Dickens never wrote a better short story than The Outcasts of Poker Flats. He never wrote as good a short story as The Luck of Roaring Camp. Boston's critics promptly realized these things and gave Harte his correct rating. That they failed to do this with Mark Twain lay chiefly in the fact that he spoke to them in new and startling tongues. His gospels were likely to be heresies. His literary eccentricities were all unclassified. Of the ultra fastidious set, Howells tells us that Charles Eliot Norton and Professor Francis J. Child were about the only ones who accorded him unqualified approval. The others smiled and enjoyed him, but with that condescension which the courtier is likely to accord to Motley and the Cap and Bells. Only the great, simple-hearted, unbiased multitude, the public, which had no standards but the direct appeal from one human heart to another, could recognize immediately his mightier heritage, could exalt and place him on the throne. Chapter 83, Lecturing Days, read by John Greenman.